Gospel according to Luke, the 21st chapter. And while some were speaking of the temple, how it was adorned with noble stones and offerings, Jesus said, "As for these things that you see, the days will come when there will not be left here one stone upon another that will not be thrown down." And they asked him, "Teacher, when will these things be? And what will be the sign when these things are about to take place?" And he said, "See that you are not led astray, for many will come in my name, saying, 'I am he,' and 'the time is at hand.' Do not go after them. And when you hear of wars and tumults, do not be terrified, for these things must take place, but the end will not be at once." Then he said to them, "Nation will rise against nation, and kingdom against kingdom. There will be great earthquakes, and in various places famines and pestilences. And there will be terrors and great signs from heaven. And before all this, they will lay their hands on you and persecute you, delivering you up to the synagogues and prisons. And you will be brought before kings and governors for my name's sake. This will be your opportunity to bear witness. Settle it therefore in your minds not to meditate beforehand how to answer. For I will give you a mouth and wisdom which none of your adversaries will be able to withstand or contradict. You'll be delivered up even by parents and brothers and relatives and friends, and some of you they will put to death. You'll be hated by all for my name's sake, but not a hair of your head will perish. By your endurance, you will gain your lives." The word of the Lord. You may be seated. How many of us have held back from doing something or taking advantage of an opportunity because we were comfortable? Of course, we don't call it that when it occurs, or when we tell that story later on. We say things such as, "Well, I just didn't know it was going to be like that." And later we attempt to convince ourselves that the missed opportunity really was the better decision to avoid. There's probably nothing in the world I hate more than getting up in the morning. And yet, while I was working for the airlines, I would often rip myself out of bed on a day that I had off so that I could catch the early flights all over the country. At the time, I hated it. But I also knew at the time I didn't believe that part of my life would ever come close to the opportunities that I would get then. Deep down, I knew there was a fate worse than early mornings. It is a regret over the missed opportunities that we can have. Yet when we actually take the risk of not letting a missed opportunity pass us by, we find we are left with the good stories, the rich memories, and dare I say, a hopeful future. Our gospel lesson today can be very confusing to us, and we can focus instead of the opportunities that Christ is presenting here on the doom and the gloom that will occur to us if we miss those opportunities. It is because we are listening to what the world is saying about Christ and not listening to what he is saying about the world that this passage becomes very confusing. Here, Jesus warns people three things to not look to. Don't look to temples built by human hands. Don't look to signs proclaimed by human voices. And don't look to deals made in human hearts. This passage opens very interestingly. Matthew and Mark both have the disciple making the declaration here about how fine the temple is, but Luke leaves that portion out. We don't know who says this. It just says someone has said this here in the Gospel of Luke. It could have been anybody, and yet Jesus finds it important to address it, whether from a disciple or just a bystander. Each Gospel writer deals also with the temple in their own way. Matthew ties it to the priestly obligations. Mark takes inventory of what the man on the street is saying about the temple. And John highlights its cosmic importance as the place where God meets humanity. But Luke, as ever, has this tendency to ground everything he talks about in history and the play of history. His gospel story begins actually, though, in the temple. For Luke, the temple is a focal point of history. His gospel story begins with an angelic messenger in the temple. And where does it end? It ends in a gospel proclamation in the temple. The gospel for Luke begins and ends in the temple. Jesus' infancy narrative, the entire passages of the infancy narrative begin and end in the temple. This apocalyptic discourse that we are finding here begins and ends in the temple. And even Jesus' pre-passion preaching, all will happen within the confines of the temple. Everything that is important is a challenge here, a challenge to the history of this temple. It is as if Luke is saying, for once in all of its history, this beautiful vessel that has held so much promise and that so many people have looked towards with hope, finally this vessel is being used for its proper purpose. That is that Jesus will be proclaiming, Jesus will be present here, and Jesus will make known God's purposes for his people here at this temple. This speaker here has remarked about the beautiful stones. There had once been Solomon's temple, and it was a beautiful place. But it was destroyed over the various cataclysms that would come marching on through the Middle East at that time. It was rebuilt, though. People rebuilt it in the 6th century BC, and they remarked how good the old one was and how futile this new one is, and yet so many prophets are prophesying in this temple, this so-called shabby temple that was born in the 6th century. Folks, God does not need beautiful vessels to proclaim his gospel message. God does not need beautiful temples to prophesy. Then Herod comes along. And of course, he made it better. He improved it. It's a much more beautiful temple, and everyone loved it for it. Everyone agreed that it was a vast improvement, worthy of a great God, this God of glory. But we come back to the stones, don't we? The stones that make this temple. You know, Jesus had a lot to say about stones, didn't he? If the people on Palm Sunday didn't welcome him, then the very stones would cry out, as we read in chapter 19. Jerusalem's enemies will not leave one stone within her because she did not know about the Messiah's visit. And finally, there is a stone which the builders have rejected, which has become the cornerstone. That, friends, is the truly beautiful stone of the temple. Too often we don't notice these stones, though. Don't notice the stones proclaiming. Don't notice the stones being carried off as congregations forget to mark the presence of the true church. Don't even notice the cornerstone, the lodestone of the church. These are the stones Christ is looking at and wants us to notice as well. And if we feel so bad for ourselves, We should take heart, since the disciples apparently were more interested in the stones of the temple made by human hands as well. Don't worry, even the disciples missed the mark. They have missed the statement, and so they demand an easy set of signs that they can follow. But Jesus turns this question around and lists instead 3 signs which aren't signs at all. Firstly, there will be signs of false messiahs. There will be signs of wars and insurrections. And finally, there will be the sense that all of the world, both natural and man-made, is coming apart at the seams. Friends, if we miss Jesus' first admonition about putting too much stock in our buildings and our prestige, we definitely miss this latter set of warnings about looking for signs. We back the movers and the shakers. We excuse their defects because we tell ourselves, at least they are shaking things up. At least we are getting a seat at the table. And we do expect to hear in every insurrection the hoofbeats of the 4 horsemen. And we have worried ourselves sick about crises after crises when we should have looked to Christ, taken stock, and been about the business of kingdom living. What the world calls signs, Christ dismisses as merely the noise. This brings us back to the final point of the whole discussion. Once again, we are far too quick to ignore Jesus and what Jesus says in order to read what it is we want to read and listen to what we want to hear. Jesus, of course, says the whole of earth is going to come to a grinding halt, like someone pulling the brakes on some runaway train. Nothing, if we really think about it, could be likelier in our fallen world. When our fallen world finally comes up again against God's planned perfect world. The restoration and restitution, the long hoped for peaceable kingdom. What we miss is that Jesus says, this isn't the important thing to remember. This isn't the important thing for us to bear in mind. Before anyone sees any of these things happen, before the destruction, before the grinding halt, before the crises and wars and insurrection, before any of that happens, the world is going to demand a confession out of the disciples. And this, Jesus says, it is here that the true sign of the end of the world will come. That true sign that declares that Jesus is Lord. That is where the Christian finds the end of the world, because for the Christian, the old world stopped at the foot of the cross and the new world began at the empty tomb. We are tempted to be a bit nervous at this point, for we now realize that we are the so-called signs of the times. When the former things of sadness, loss, separation, and, well, strangeness have passed away, we are supposed to be the signs that there is a new hope, that our neighbors, our friends, and yes, even our enemies can lay their burdens down at that foot of the cross. We are the signs of the times. The signs of the times are not written in the stars or the earthquakes. They're written in the changed heart of everyone who accepts Jesus as Lord. Would that the heavens, we say, be the proclaimers of this, and not us fumbling humans. And yet here we are, once again shown to be the pinnacle of all creation, because in our lungs, in our voices, in our hands, in our hearts, lies this new story of a new creation and the passing of the old world. But Christ shares one more thing with us. Something that we often miss in the doom and gloom and the fear of our own proclamation, Christ tells us one more thing. We are commanded not to tell what we know, but to recount what we believe. Christ promises, just as he promised to cover our sanctification, just as he promised to cover our reconciliation, Christ also promises to cover our confession. Don't worry. Don't be afraid when people ask you. Pray. Let the Spirit come within you, and then you will be able to share this good news. Don't worry. Don't be afraid that you aren't qualified. Christ has already shown that he is qualified. If Christ is qualified to carry your burdens, Christ is also qualified to make that confession for you. God's promise for you and for me and all of creation has not been made on temples built by human hands, or signs confessed by human voices, or deals made in the human heart. Rather, Christ's promise for a new creation has been built on the one thing that is unshakable in this world. It has been built on Christ himself, and Christ alone. When heaven and earth passes, the word, the promise, the confession, these things will remain. And friends, if these things remain, that is our sign to a needy world. Amen.